All right, hey there, everybody. Thank you for coming to Demystifying Code for Admins, the last step to Apex. All right, first of all, thank you to our great sponsors. If you haven't had the chance, make sure to check them out in the expo. These events do not happen without our sponsors, so if you are a sponsor here, thank you very much for sponsoring. All right, a little about me to start. So my name is Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce technical architect with Google. 16 Salesforce certifications, 7-time Trailhead Ranger, and as of this year, a Salesforce MVP Hall of Famer. I'm very passionate about giving back to the community, speaking at events, helping people learn to code, specifically on Salesforce. I'm a Rad Women coach. I've helped lead 10 cohorts. So if you are a woman in Salesforce administration interested in learning to code, definitely recommend checking out Rad Women. This is my first time in London and my first time ever presenting in Europe, so it is the 4th continent I've presented on. Thank you. So my previous goal was to be able to speak on 6 different continents, so I still have Australia and Africa to go, although last year I met someone who organized a cruise ship down to Antarctica with a tech conference. So not Salesforce, unfortunately, but something to consider for the future. Feel free to connect with me afterward, though, on Twitter, Adam17AMO, LinkedIn, Adam Olshansky. If you're interested in studying for the Platform Developer 1 certification or the Advanced Administrator certification, I also have some Pluralsight courses. I'm not a big fan of paying for things personally, so if you would like a free trial, there's a link there for a 10-day free trial, bit.ly/AO free trial. If you want a 30-day free trial, though, I do have some trial codes, so make sure to see me after. Happy to hand some of those out as well. All right. So again, as I said, my first time in London, first time in the United Kingdom. I'm a very big Harry Potter fan. I've been here since Monday, so I got to check out Platform 9 3/4 and the Harry Potter studio tour. Got a picture in front of Hogwarts. Took a tour of the Westminster area. Got to see the King, so that was kind of cool. And then I also checked out what apparently is not Big Ben, but is the Elizabeth Tower, I've been told, with the Big Ben bell inside of it. So that was new information to me. And in addition to being around London, I spent a little bit of time in Scotland. So first time in the UK. So welcome those of you from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. My Salesforce Euro trip friend Pallavi and I have been going around checking out some of the Salesforce conferences, so we got a nice Boba Blazers picture in front of Edinburgh Castle as well. All right, so as cool as it would be to talk about my trip around London, that is not why you are here, but as I mentioned, I'm a big Harry Potter fan, so you may see some more Harry Potter references throughout. All right, so why are you here? So let me set some expectations, kind of what I'm hoping you're going to get out of the talk today. So some of you may already be familiar with declarative development, and I'm going to really quickly go over some declarative tools you already know how to use, and less about the functionality of the tools. I want you to think about some of the concepts you're using behind some of these tools. I'm also going to show you some small blocks of code, and I want you to try to understand what they're doing. It's OK if you don't understand every little punctuation mark and syntax. You can always look those up, what they do. So don't worry less about the syntax and more about what the code is actually doing. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to teach you how to code within 40 minutes, as much as I would love to. But what I do want to be able to do within 40 minutes is help you begin the process of being able to understand code. I'm a big believer that if you can understand code and you can do a Google search, you can begin the process of writing code. And with ChatGPT, you don't even need to do a Google search anymore. But I work for Google, so don't tell them I said that. All right. Understanding code alone, though, can already help improve your value to your company and increase your career prospects as well. Right? Think about if you're an admin going up against another admin for a job. One of you can talk the developer's language, one of you can't. One of you can write a little bit of code, one of you can't. Maybe going to give you a step up. Maybe you want to go into development full time and be able to write code for your career. Maybe you just want to be able to talk to developers better or write a little bit of code to solve a problem you can't quite get with the declarative tools. Understanding code can only help. All right, now as I mentioned, sometimes the people who can write code tend to get paid a little bit more also, so that doesn't necessarily hurt either. All right, so agenda for today, I'm going to start off kind of high level. What is code, Apex? What are we talking about when I'm talking about code? Do a brief review of the admin tools and concepts you already know how to use. Going to go into some Apex building blocks, tie it back to the admin concepts we discussed, put it all together and walk through some Apex examples, and then kind of wrap things up and talk about next steps and where to go from here. All right, so my hypothesis is that you're already all developers. You just may not know it yet. And hopefully by the end of the talk, you will agree with me. All right, and Hagrid agrees with me as well. All right, so first question, when we keep talking about code, what is code? I promise it's not as scary as it sounds like. At the end of the day, code is just computer language. It's ones and zeros that the computer can understand. Now, I don't know about you. I do not speak in ones and zeros. And so developers have come up with compilers, which are basically translators, to translate code and configuration that we write into the ones and zeros that computers can understand. You may be familiar with this without knowing it if you've ever written a Salesforce formula and clicked the check syntax button. That's the compiler trying to translate whatever you wrote in the formula to the ones and zeros that Salesforce can understand so it knows what to do. Right? It's the same sort of thing if I use the word compiler, that's all that means. It's trying to translate the code and configuration you wrote into something a computer, or in our case, Salesforce, can understand. Right? And over time, developers, again, not really speaking in ones and zeros, have gotten a little bit better. So when code first started out, we were physically punching holes into cards, right? Punches were ones, no punches were zeros, and we were feeding this into giant computers for them to read. That was kind of annoying, so we started getting a little bit more advanced. We started telling the computer, hey, let's, in this part of your memory, store this value, and that part, store that value, and put the result in this other place. Again, that was kind of annoying. So we started developing programming languages like C that started using logic. We moved on to really focusing on that logic with languages like Java and later Apex. And Salesforce finally said, you know what, we don't even need to write all this code anymore. We can do all this stuff declaratively. And that's kind of where our Salesforce configuration comes in. And this is primarily as admins where we've been working. Now, I mentioned a compiler is kind of like a translator. Now, I know I'm in Europe. A lot of people speak different languages. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of when you translate things, sometimes something gets lost in translation, right? And as I move farther and farther away from the ones and zeros, a little bit more tends to be lost. And as a result, I can't talk to the computer as well as I could if I was physically punching in the ones and zeros. So we're going to take one step closer to the ones and zeros and talk about the code today, a little bit away from the configuration, and it's going to allow us to do a little bit more on the Salesforce platform. All right, so what makes admin superheroes? I'm going to go over a brief review of admin tools that you probably already know how to use. And again, I want you to focus on the concepts behind all of these tools. All right, so when I talk about admin tools, I'm talking about things like objects and fields, reports, formulas, workflow rules, process builder, and flow. Obviously, workflow and process builder, you're probably not making any new ones, but you've probably used them before. Maybe you've built some in the past. I remember when I was first starting out, workflow rules were very easy to understand and build, and it's a little bit harder to start off building a complex flow. So the concepts, I think, are pretty similar across all the automation tools, though. All right, and again, celebrate some of the tools that you're building there. All right, so let's start off with objects and fields. At the end of the day, when I'm building an object in a field, all I'm really doing is telling Salesforce what my data model is going to look like. I'm telling it what type of value it's going to be. And I'm giving it a name, right? And you may be most familiar with the field label or the object label. But as a developer, as a coder, I'm most interested in the API name, right? And that's what we're going to be using in our code. You may also see this get used in formula fields. And the API name, all it really is we take all the spaces, turn them into underscores, and then we add underscore underscore C to the end. Spaces and code don't really play well together, so to make that easier, we just use underscores instead. Underscore underscore C just means that it's custom. So if I have the account object, the API name is just going to be account. If I have a custom job application object, it's going to be job application underscore underscore C. That's all that syntax means. But again, this concept, I tell it what type of data I want, and I give it some sort of API name. Right, reports, we built reports before, and the concept behind reports is we want to do some sort of query for records based on some condition, right? When I build a report, I have to tell Salesforce what object or objects do I want to build my reports on? What fields do I want to include? What filter criteria do I want to use? And I'm going to end up getting some records back, right? Something we've done before, fairly straightforward concept there. All right, formulas. If you think about a formula field, it's this concept that we're going to take some input, some value we can calculate that we know. We're going to put it into our formula black box, and then we're going to output some sort of value, again, whose data type we have to specify ahead of time when we're creating any type of field. And some of these formulas may look like this, right? I can take a value of today's date, I can add 5 to it, and I'm going to output some sort of date, right? I don't necessarily have to care about what the formula is doing. I know that I'm taking a value I know, doing some calculation and computation to it, and outputting another value. And I can also have a formula like the one below here, right? I'm going to take, I have a conditional statement that says, hey, if this user has 5 years of experience and their job department is IT, they need approval. Now, this syntax, to me, is a little bit harder to read with the and, so I'm going to turn it into coding syntax with the double ampersand, but it means the same thing, right? If the years of experience is greater than 5 and the job department is IT, approval is required. And again, note we're using the API names here with the _ C, and for the related job, we have the _ R as well. All right, and we can make more complex formulas, right? We can take a value and pass it up through a chain and do different function calls to it and get a more complex value. So I can start with maybe the date and time I submitted an application. So I was pretty close on estimating here. We have a date and time here, June 9th at about 3:30 p.m. And that's our date and time is submitted. And I want to turn that into a text value, right? What is the hour in text that I submitted this? So I'm going to start with the date and time. I'm going to pass that through the time value function, and I'm going to get 1530. I'm going to pass that into the hour function. I'm going to get the number 15, and then I'm going to pass it into the text function, and I'm going to get the text 15. And so if I think about this, I'm taking a value I know, the date and time I submitted it, passing it through my formula black box, and getting the text value 15 at the end. Right? And again, we can have multiple conditions in our formulas as well, right? Something like this on the left basically says, hey, if our amount value on an opportunity is greater than 1 million, set the priority to high. If that's not true, let's check our next condition. If it's greater than 100,000, set it to medium. Otherwise, we have a fallback, set it to low, right? We can have multiple conditions, some way to fall back as well. I think case assignment rules work pretty similar to this too. Right, and then we start getting into our automation, right? If we're building workflow rules, we have this concept of telling Salesforce what object we want to fire on, right? We have a concept of naming our automation, and then we tell it what events we want it to fire on. Do we want to fire when records are created, when they're updated, or when they're updated to meet criteria? And then once we do that, we're going to set some sort of criteria. Again, when do we actually want this workflow to fire? And we can specify some filter logic as well. And then we're going to end up taking some sort of action. Maybe we're updating a field, maybe we're creating a task, right? Things like that. And Process Builder works kind of the same, right? We can have maybe more complex logic in how we want to set it up. Again, we're going to choose an object, when it's going to fire, and what we want it to do. We can get a little more advanced in what actions we're taking. Maybe we want to call some Apex, maybe we want to post a chatter, things like that. And we can make really complex processes and drag things around and create an ultimately better business process as a result, execute multiple conditions and take multiple actions and choose the order in which they fire. And then with flows, we really get to kind of go crazy, and we can do even more there. And when you create a record-triggered flow specifically, we're going to specify, hey, we want this flow to fire when something happens on an object. And we can specify, hey, do I want this to fire before the record is saved to the database or after the record is saved to the database? And there's pros and cons to both of those there. But if we built record-triggered flows, we're kind of familiar with this idea. And again, with flows, we introduce the concept of variables, right? I'm going to take some value, and I'm going to save it for later. I'm going to store it as a variable. I'm going to use it later on in my flow. And again, just like with fields, we're going to tell Salesforce what type of variable that's going to be. And we can also have collections variables, right? We can store multiple values at once in a single collection and then loop through them. So maybe here I have a list of names I'm going to loop through, and I want to be checking each name one by one. With flows also, we have this concept of variables. Do we want them to be available for input? Do we want them to be available for output? Are we sending the data somewhere else? Are we taking some data in from somewhere else in Salesforce? And then lastly, in flow, we can do a bunch of other things as well. Again, some variable assignments, some conditional logic with decision elements, looping through our collections. And once again, just like workflow and process builder, we can manipulate records, right? We can create records, update records, delete records with flows, and also query records as well. Okay, so I talked about a bunch of stuff you already know, and then you're probably asking, well, why did I do that? And I promise there is a good reason. And the reason is because all these concepts we just talked about with the declarative tools are actually the exact same concepts that we use in Apex, right? We talked about being able to create conditional logic. We have them in formulas, we have them in flow, we have them in process builder, and we have them in workflow rules. And in Apex, we have them as well. We just call them if statements. We talked about the idea of creating variables, and we want to specify a data type beforehand, right? We also specify data types when we're creating custom fields. And of course, we create variables with data types in flow as well. And in Apex, we also create variables, and they're just called variables. I mentioned how we can chain logic together with our different automation tools, right? Formula fields, we can have things passed up the chain. flows, we can create different processes. Process builders, obviously, we can chain logic together as well. And in Apex, we also chain logic together. We just call them methods and classes. I mentioned that we can query for records, right? We're querying for records, looking for records when we're building a report. We can also have the query records element in flow. And in Apex, the way we query records is called SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language, very similar to SQL, if anyone has used SQL before. I also talked about this concept of choosing some sort of object and when an action should fire on it, right? We do it with flow, we do it with process builder, we do it with workflow, and in Apex, we do it with triggers. I mentioned that we can loop over collection variables as well, right? We do it in flow, we can also do it in process builder, and we can also do it in Apex. And in Apex, we call them for loops. Right? For each record in our list, we're going to loop through it one by one. And then lastly, I talked about the idea that we can manipulate Salesforce records, S-object records. We can do it in flow, we can do it in process builder, we can do it in workflow. And in Apex, we do it using something called DML, database manipulation language. So if there's nothing else you get away from this, all of the concepts you already know how to use on the declarative side are the same concepts you're using when you're writing Apex. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and prove that to you. All right, so I mentioned this formula before, right? We have some conditional logic, and we have different conditions with a fallback. And in Apex, it looks something like this. And I'm going to walk through this a little bit here, line by line. So first thing at a high level, just like we have an if function in our formula, we have an if statement in our Apex. And we're going to say if the amount on some opportunity record, right? So when we're dealing with formulas, we know what record it's on already, because it's part of the record. In Apex, we just have to tell it what record we're working with. So we're going to work with some opportunity called opportunity. And we're checking the amount on that opportunity. And if the amount is greater than 1 million, set the priority on that same opportunity to high, just like we do in our formula field. We also have another keyword here, else. That's just how we move on to our next condition in Apex. Else, if the first condition is not true, let's check the next condition. If the amount is greater than 100,000, set the priority to medium. And just like in our formula, we have a fallback, set the priority to low. Same thing in Apex. Instead of another else if with a condition, we just use the word else, fallback, set the priority to low if it wasn't greater than the other two. All right, we also talked about this idea of creating variables and specifying a data type beforehand. And again, we do that in Apex as well. And so here are some variables we can create in Apex. And once again here, there's this concept of specifying what type of data are we creating. So one example is we can create a variable of type integer, which is just how we say number in code. So if you're creating a number field or a decimal field in your data model, you're going to use potentially an integer in Apex. And so I can have an integer called myInt and set it equal to the number 10. Right? Just like with a field, we tell it what type of data it is, we tell it what the name is, and now we're specifying a value for it. String is just how we say text in code. So I have a text value called myString. It's equal to Harry Potter is awesome, all inside of our single quotes. That's what tells the code, hey, here's what my text is going to be. In addition to having variables of type integer and string, we can also have Salesforce record variables, just like we can in Flow. So I can have a variable of type account. I can call it my ACCT. I can call it whatever I want. And I can set it equal to an empty new account. And then just like in Flow also, we can have collection variables. And so an example of a collection in code is a list. So I can have a list of type integer, so just a bunch of integers in one variable. And I can call it my int list, and I can give it the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's all going to be one variable. And then lastly, we could also have a list of strings, houses. Again, another Harry Potter reference. I can have Gryffindor and Ravenclaw, and I can put them in a single list of strings. All right, we talked about this idea of formulas, right? We take some value we know, we pass it into some black box, does a calculation, gives us another output value whose data type we specify beforehand. And again, in Apex, we do the same thing. We just call them methods. So we take some input parameters that we know. We're going to run some logic and computation, calculation on it. And then we're going to return some value, again, whose data type we specify ahead of time. So we talked about this formula before, right? We're taking the value we know today, we're adding 5 to it, and we're going to end up with a date value. And I'm going to do something similar now in code. And I'm going to start actually in line 5 here. I'm just going to make a new variable called of type integer called myInt, and I'm going to set it equal to the number 12. And line 6, I'm going to have another variable, again of type integer, and now called myNewInt. And instead of instead of setting it to a value outright, I'm going to set it to the value of whatever the result is of add5 myInt. Okay, what the heck is add5 myInt? Add5 is a method that I've defined in line 1 that's going to do my calculation. And I'm going to pass in as an input the value of myInt, which we know from line 5 is 12. And if I look at line 1 at our method signature here, I see a couple things. First of all, in the parentheses, I see that I'm taking integer x as an input. So I can call that whatever I want. I'm taking in some integer as the input. And the red box in line 1, I'm going to return an integer. So just like our formula, we say, hey, I need to end up with a date at the end of this. Same thing with our method. I'm taking in an integer, and in this case, I'm going to output an integer at the end. The other thing we see in line 2 is the keyword return. So this tells our method, hey, this is my output value. So just like in our formula, we're doing a calculation, and we end up with a date. Same thing here. I start with an integer, I'm going to end with an integer, and I'm going to end with the integer x plus 5, where we passed in x. So in our case, we're passing in myInt. MyInt is 12. 12 becomes our x. We're returning x plus 5. So 12 plus 5 is 17. So if later on in my code, after line 6, I use the variable myNewInt, I'm going to be pretty confident it's going to be the value 17, because that's what I calculated in my method. All right, and we can make more complex methods as well. So we talked about this method before, where I'm taking a long date time value and I'm turning it into a text value using a bunch of different functions that I'm passing it to in my formula. And I'm going to do the same thing here in my code. And so I'm going to start in line 10, and I'm going to declare a new string or a text value called myHour, and I'm going to set it equal to whatever the result is of a method call to getApplicationSubmitHour, where I pass in the date time submitted, which again is going to be June 9th at 3:30 p.m. or 15:30, as we say in London, I guess. And so I'm going to pass that from line 10 into line 1. And again, my input in my parentheses I see is a date time value that I'm going to call dt. I can call it whatever I want. And I also see in line 1 my box. I'm starting with a date time. I have to end up with a string. Just like in our formula, we started with a date time, ended up with text. Same thing in our code. We're starting with a date time. We're going to end up with a text value. And just like I do in my formula, I'm going to do the same thing in my code. I'm going to start with my date time, and I'm going to get the hour from it. So just like we have an hour function in our formula, we have an hour method in Apex. So I can get the hour of my integer. In line 3, I'm going to set it to a variable of type integer called hour. I'm going to take my hour variable from line 3, and in line 5, just like we have the text function in our formula, we have something called string.valueOf in code, which basically turns anything into a string. So I'm going to take my number, which is going to be 15. I'm going to turn it into the text 15, and now I have a new variable called hour in text 15. We took our date time, we turned it into a string. Line 7, we are ready to return it, and I can go return the value 15. So if I execute line 10 anywhere later on in my code, I'm going to be pretty confident that the myHour variable is going to be the value 15 in text form. All right, we talked about this idea, again, of reports, right? I can choose an object, I can specify some fields on it, and I can specify a filter criteria of the records I want to get back. And in Apex, this is SOQL. And it looks something like this. But again, you'll notice we're doing the same thing that we do in reports. We're specifying some fields. We use the word select to tell it what fields we want. We have the word from. We tell it what object we want, just like we did in our report. And then we have the word where, and we're specifying some condition. So just like in our report, we specified, hey, I want all of my accounts, where the type is customer direct or customer channel. Same thing here in our SOQL. And so if I go into any new developer org and I run a report with on account, these fields, this filter, or I run this SOQL query, these fields, this object, this where clause, I'm going to get the same exact values there, right? And so every SOQL statement you see is going to start the same way. It's going to be select some fields from some object where some condition is true. All right, we talked about this idea of choosing an object that our automation should fire on and when specifically it should fire, right? We specify, hey, I want to fire my flow when a record is created, record is updated, record is deleted. And I'm going to do the same thing in my Apex triggers. And so every trigger, if you go into your setup menu and look up Apex triggers and go to any trigger, they're all going to look something like this. They're going to start off with the word trigger. They're going to have the name of the trigger, just like we name our automation. We're going to name our trigger as well. We can name it whatever we want. Generally, they're going to be named something like this. If it's going to be on the account object, I'll name it account trigger. We specify what object it's going to fire on, so on account in our case. And then we specify when it should fire. Just like in our record-triggered flows, we specify before or after. So in our case, I want to fire my trigger before records are saved to the database, when records are inserted, updated, or deleted. And every trigger you see is going to start like this. The word trigger, the name of the trigger, what object it's on, and what events it's going to fire on. So if you're troubleshooting what's happening when something's happening to a record, you can look at your triggers and figure out which one's firing for which conditions. All right, we talked about this idea of looping over collections in flows and also in Process Builder. And again, in Apex, we call those for loops. And that's because they use the keyword for. And I don't think I have a box here. OK. So I'm going to start off again with a list of opportunities called oplist. And I'm calling out to some method called getOpportunityList, but I'm getting back a list of opportunities. And I'm going to loop through this list of opportunities one by one. So I'm going to say for each opportunity, then I'm going to temporarily call O. I can call it whatever I want. For each opportunity O in my op list from line 1, I want to set the amount on the current O to 10,000. So all my opportunities is going to go set the amount to all of them for 10,000. Okay. Maybe not tremendously useful, but we can also do calculations with for loops. So I can have a for loop something like this, where I maybe start out with the same list of integers we had before, right? My int list equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to go count up what's the total of all the values in my list. So I'm going to declare a new variable in line 2 called total. I'm going to set it equal to 0 to start. And I'm going to pass it through my loop. So for each integer, I'm going to call I in my int list. Again, I can call the temporary variable whatever I want. For each integer I in my int list, I want to add the previous value of total plus I and set it equal to the new total. So the first time it runs, I is going to be the value of 1. So the total is going to be 0 plus 1. Our total is going to increase to 1. OK, for loop keeps running. I moves to 2. Total equals 1 plus 2, which is 3. We keep going in our loop. We add 3 to our total, it becomes 6. We add 4 to our total, it becomes 10. And then finally, we get to our last I. We add 5 to our total. And if I use the total variable after this block of code, I'm going to be confident the total value is going to be 15. And the for loop knows once it's gone through the entire list, automatically exit and keep executing the code. Right, and then lastly, we talked about being able to change Salesforce records. And in Apex, we do that with DML, Database Manipulation Language. And it's kind of its own language, but it's a pretty straightforward language, I would say. I think there's only 4 or 5 keywords to it. And I kind of think of DML as hitting a button in the Salesforce UI. So if you think about it, if you open a new account record and you enter a bunch of values and then you close out of the tab, Salesforce isn't actually going to save anything because you didn't hit the save button. So same thing with DML. Unless I call the DML statement, Salesforce is kind of going to ignore whatever data I put in there. So in my case, in line 1, I'm going to create a new account, and I'm going to pass in the name of Hogwarts. But until I run my DML statement in line 2, it's not going to get saved. So I'm going to insert my new account in line 2, and if I run these first 2 lines of code in an org, I'm going to have a new account named Hogwarts. If we move on to line 4, I'm going to have a SOQL query here. I'm going to query from my org. I'm going to get the amount field from the opportunity object where the account name is Westeros. And I'm going to set that to an opportunity called op. And I want to set the amount on my opportunity to $1 million. I call another DML statement to actually update that record. Again, I'm changing a value, but I have to run the DML to save it, just like I would in the UI. Let's say I made a mistake. I don't want to deal with that opportunity anymore. I'm going to go delete it. I can run another DML statement using the keyword delete. OK. So let's go put some of these building blocks together now and see what a little small snippet of code might look like. OK, before we do that, let's first talk about where Apex lives. So Apex, basically, you can think of it as just living in various files within Salesforce. And there are basically 2 different flavors of Apex. All of your Apex is going to be either in a trigger or in a class. And triggers, kind of like your declarative automation, are always going to fire as the result of some event, right? Accounts are inserted, opportunities are updated, right? Some event has to happen to fire your triggers. The other place code can live is going to be Apex classes. Classes can be called by a trigger. They can be called by another class. They can be called on a schedule. Maybe they want to run some code every night at midnight, so I can schedule that. And I can also call it from declarative tools, right? I can use invocable actions in Flow or in Process Builder to call some code as well. But something has to tell my code to run if it's in a class. Okay, so let's walk through a quick trigger example here where we're firing on some sort of account event. So I'm going to start with a new trigger here. So I'm going to start with a new trigger. Again, every trigger starts the same way. The word trigger, the name of the trigger on some object, in our case account, and when it's going to fire. So I want to fire this trigger when accounts are inserted and updated before they're saved to the database. And I'm going to create a new variable in line 3, a list of accounts. I'm going to name it new accounts. I can name it whatever I want, ideally something useful that tells me what it is. And I'm going to set it equal to something called trigger.new, which is basically a magic thing in a trigger to basically get all the new values of my records. So if I'm updating values, I can then compare the values of trigger.old and trigger.new and make changes accordingly, do some conditional checks and things like that. So these are just basically, it's a list of all the newly inserted or newly updated accounts. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to put it in a separate variable called new accounts. I'm also going to declare a new list of cases in line 4 called cases to insert, just an empty list of cases. So I'm going to be doing something with cases on all these newly inserted and updated accounts. Okay, and now I want to have a loop here. I want to loop through my new accounts. So in line 6, I'm going to say for each account that I'm going to call whatever I want. I'm going to call it ACCT here for simplicity. For each account, ACCT in my new accounts, I want to actually do a check on each of these accounts. And I'm going to say, okay, if the annual revenue is greater than 500,000, set the rating to hot. Otherwise, if the rating is greater than 100,000, set the rating to warm. Otherwise, if the annual revenue is less than 100,000, set the rating to cold. All right, so I update all my accounts. And if the rating is cold, I also want to create a new case to let somebody know, hey, maybe we need to take some action on this. What can we do to increase the value of this account here? And so we're going to use a method here. So in line 14, I'm going to create a new case of type case called new case. And we'll notice instead of giving it a specific value, I'm going to call a method in another class. So I have a class called account trigger handler. Remember, code can live in our triggers or our classes, and our classes have to be called from something. So I'm going to call it from my trigger. I have a class called account trigger handler, and in account trigger handler, I have a method called create case. That create case method is going to take in an account as we seek, so we're passing in an account. We're going to pass in an account, and we're going to end up with a case, and that's how we can assign it to our new case variable in line 14. So we start with an account, and we're ending up with a case. Okay, let's take a look at our create case method in our account trigger handler class now. So I have a class called account trigger handler, similar to a trigger. It starts with the word class, starts with the name of the class, and I'm going to, just like we saw before, have a method in here. So don't worry about the public static for now, but we see this method here is, I think I have a box around this. Yeah, we're going to end up with a case like I mentioned, and we're going to pass in an account. So we're starting with an account, we're creating a case based on that account. And I'm going to use that account to get some information from it when I'm creating my case. So line 2, I'm creating a new case, and I'm setting the subject, the account ID, the owner ID, all based on information from this account I passed in line 2. Setting a description, setting a status, and then in line 11, we have our case from our account. We're going to return our case. Where are we returning it to? We're returning it back to our trigger, where in line 15, we'll be able to add it to our cases to insert list that we created in line 4. So I started with an empty list of cases. I'm looping through all my accounts one by one, calling out a method in another class, kind of like you might do with a subflow, for example, and putting some of that logic elsewhere to make this a little easier to read. Creating a case for all of my cold accounts, adding it to my list. And again, remember, Salesforce will kind of ignore it unless we have our DML statement. So once we have all our cases, I can go insert all of those cases into Salesforce. So if I run this code in a dev org, presumably that has a bunch of accounts in it, I'll get some cases for all of my cold accounts. All right. So let's talk a little bit about where to kind of practice, show off your skills, and continue your process of understanding code. I know we went through quite a bit here today. To summarize, though, at the end of the day, code is just ones and zeros, computer language, and declarative tools make it a lot easier to write code. Declarative tools are based on various concepts, and hopefully you agree with me that a lot of the Apex concepts are based on the same things you already know how to do on the declarative side, just with kind of in a little bit different language, I guess. We can also combine all of the Apex concepts and building blocks into triggers and classes. I also mentioned that I'm a big believer that if you can begin the process of understanding code, and you can do a Google search, you can use ChatGPT, you can begin the process of writing actual code. Salesforce also has a bunch of examples out there, Apex recipes, working code that you can take and kind of understand and mold to your needs. There's a joke among developers, 75% of all code is copied and pasted. And there is some truth to that, right? None of us want to reinvent the wheel. So if we can find some code is working, we can understand what it's doing, we can kind of massage it and tweak it a little bit to do what we need to do. And if you understand the declarative side of the Salesforce platform and add a little bit of the coding syntax to it, you can begin the process of understanding code. And if you still don't feel like a developer yet, I promise you that you're almost there. All right, so where do you go to learn more? The first place I always suggest is Trailheads, a couple Trailhead badges. Just search for kind of Apex basics to get some of those. One of my coworkers at Google, David Liu, has a great website, sfdc99.com, with some more examples. Another great resource, Women Code Heroes by Kieran Jameson, who is I think a trailblazer evangelist at Salesforce now. She's one of the founders of Rad Women, so I recommend checking out that program as well. Again, shameless plug, I have some Pluralsight courses if you're interested in going after the PD1 certification. And again, see me if you're interested in a 30-day free trial code for that. But also, in addition to that, I challenge you all, when you go back to work, whenever that is, whether it's next week, later on, if you're like me and on vacation, go into your orgs and go into the setup menu, search for Apex triggers, search for Apex classes, and walk through it a little bit. Ask yourself, what is the journey that happens when some event happens on some object? And I think that you're going to understand a little more than you previously thought. But try to look for some of those concepts in there, the SOQL queries, the triggers, the for loops, the if statements, and the DML as well, and you can begin the process of understanding what's happening in the code when objects are being acted on, and maybe help your developers do a little bit of the troubleshooting, or do the troubleshooting yourself as well. All right, with that, happy to take any questions. Yes, and I think we have a microphone, because I think this is being recorded.
Yeah, on your, am I on? Yeah, on your example on the trigger, you declared that you're receiving a list. Is that just best practice to always assume you're going to get more than one object in, so it's already batch ready, versus
yes,
if you had not declared a list that you're receiving, you'd hit an error?
Yeah, so best practice is always what's called to bulkify your code. Always assume you're going to be receiving a lot of records. Because what will happen, and some of you may have experienced this with Flow, you'll run into limits, what are called governor limits. It's because Salesforce is a multi-tenant platform, it's shared architecture, you're kind of limited in how many resources you can use. So you're only allowed a certain amount of SOQL queries per transaction, a certain amount of DML statements per transaction. You're only allowed to act on a certain number of records per transaction. You can only query a certain number of records, update a certain number of records. So always assume that you are getting a lot of records at once and act on them in bulk as much as you can, both to avoid limits and for performance reasons as well.
Shouldn't there the add new case method also work on lists?
The add new case method, shouldn't that also work on lists?
Yes, because you made it to work on a record.
Yes. So I think the reason I did that, let me go back to that real quick. Yeah, so theoretically you're saying I could have passed in my account list. Again, I think so here I only wanted to create cases for cold accounts. So theoretically I could have passed in my account list and then done the filtering there. So kind of preference either way. Generally, it's best practice to actually not put your logic in a trigger. So actually, that would have maybe been even better to put all that logic in a class. Because again, I can call classes from other places. I cannot call triggers from other places. I can only call triggers when things happen to records.
Hey, it's a really basic one. When you're referencing other Apex classes, is there a quick way when you're looking at a chunk of code to know that it is an Apex class that's being referenced? Is it in a different format, or?
Yeah, so developers sometimes, I'm very kind of picky when it comes to what's capitalized and what's not, and the reason is for that exact reason. So for example, my class here, it's in capital letters, which tells me, hey, this is a class, versus you'll see all my variables are what's called camel case. It starts small, lowercase, and every new word is uppercase to instantly tell me as a reader that it's a variable. Some people follow this syntax better than others. But generally, yeah, there are definitely some things where something will look like a class, and I'll have to go, and maybe it's part of the Salesforce language, maybe it's a class. So again, as with all things, experience helps, but generally, you'll see it kind of starting with a capital letter like that. All right, I think we might have time for one or two more. Yeah. All right, maybe one more question. I think I'm getting the thing here.
Are there any important differences between working with Flow and working with Apex that you need to know of if you...
Between working with Flow and working with Apex?
Yep.
I think so. Every release, I think they're adding more and more things to Flow. For example, record-triggered flows, they started saying, hey, you can do it before and after records are saved. I think they started adding batch things to Flow. They started adding asynchronous processing to Flow. I think, again, generally, best practice is clicks before code when you can. But as you start getting more and more complex, I think things with like nested for loops, if you want a for loop within a for loop, that's very difficult to do with Flow, but it's very easy to do with Apex. And so kind of using your best judgment. The other thing I would say is, in some cases, some teams are very heavy declarative, some teams are very heavy programmatic, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to write a single flow if everything else on the account object is in a trigger, for example. So you want to make sure there's kind of one point to go to. So with that, I think that is it, but definitely see me after if you want a Pluralsight code or any other questions. Thank you.
Eden with Salesforce is a game changer, an easy-to-use financial package that provides advanced features that you simply can't get from Xero or QuickBooks. It's based on a simple truth that integrating your finance and CRM systems on Salesforce is efficient. All your data's in one place. There are no integrations. Dashboards deliver your reporting without complicated Excel spreadsheets. Native Salesforce automates the mundane. Implementation is quick in one VAT quarter, and minimal training is required. There are 3 versions: free forever, economy, and business class, which adds more sophisticated features and multi-companies. And it's all backed up with a 12-month, no argument, money-back guarantee. Thank you for listening.